So let's now talk about the formation of bone tissue. So during development, most bones begin as hyaline cartilage, but some bones, like the cranial bones of the skull and the clavicles, begin as a fibrous connective tissue. So because the skeleton begins as cartilage and fibrous connective tissue, mitosis can occur much more rapidly in these tissues than it does in bony tissue. So this means that the skeleton is able to grow much more quickly in size before bone is laid down to replace it. Skeletal growth would be a lot slower if our skeleton was made of bony tissue during development than it would be if it were made of the hyaline cartilage and fibrous connective tissue that it is. So hyaline cartilage and fibrous connective tissue give our skeleton the ability to grow much bigger, much more rapidly than it would be if it were bone to begin with. So if we look at the processes of bone tissue formation, we have two processes. We have endochondral ossification and intramembranous ossification. Now, endochondral ossification, ossification just means formation of bone tissue. Endochondral means within bones. So endo means within, chondral means within cartilage here. And so endochondral ossification is the type of ossification that occurs when hyaline cartilage is replaced by bone. And so this is kind of the majority of the bone tissue formation that we see in the skeleton, since the skeleton is initially mostly made of hyaline cartilage. Some of the bones, though, that are made out of fibrous connective tissue undergo intramembranous ossification, in which the fibrous connective tissue is replaced by bony tissue. And so recall that the bones that are initially made out of fibrous connective tissues are the cranial bones and the clavicles. And so these are the bones that undergo that intramembranous ossification. So we've seen how bone tissue is formed. Now let's take a look at how bones actually go about lengthening once they're formed. And bone lengthening occurs during both infancy and adolescence. So this bone lengthening stops at adulthood, which explains why we don't continue to get taller as we get past about 25 years of age or so. So this is seen primarily during both infancy and adolescence. It occurs at locations in long bones, I should say, called the epiphyseal plates. So bone lengthening is going to be occurring in long bones, and we see a structure in long bones called epiphyseal plates, which epiphyseal plates are found at the junction between the epiphysis and the diaphysis of a long bone here. The epiphyseal plates are made out of hyaline cartilage, and essentially what happens with lengthening of bone tissue at the epiphyseal plate, or the basic way that this works, is that if this is the epiphysis right here and this is the diaphysis of a long bone that is growing here, what we see is that new cartilage is formed by mitosis on the side of the epiphyseal plate that's closest to the epiphysis here. And so what happens is that we got new cartilage forming on this side, old cartilage on the side of the epiphyseal plate that is closest to the diaphysis, or the shaft of the long bone, is replaced by bony tissue. So what we end up getting over time is that new cartilage forms on one side, old cartilage is replaced by bone on the other side, and slowly the bone grows longer. And so that's what you're seeing in this diagram here, is a time sequence or a progression sequence of lengthening of this particular long bone in this diagram here. So a hormone called growth hormone, unsurprisingly, which is released by the anterior pituitary gland, is what controls the rate at which the epiphyseal plates grow. That is, growth hormone has control over the rate at which the cartilage in the epiphyseal plates undergoes mitosis. It has control over other things as well, but this is one of the things that it primarily has control over in order for us to grow taller as we age. So what this means is that the more growth hormone that we have released from the anterior pituitary, the more growth we will see in our long bones, and the taller that person will be. So as adolescence ends, what happens is that mitosis of the epiphyseal plates cartilage starts to begins to slow down, and eventually what happens is that epiphyseal plate growth slows enough that the bone replacing that cartilage causes the epiphyseal plate to be completely replaced by bone. And so this is a process called epiphyseal plate closure. And this diagram is essentially showing that here on the left side here. These white arrows show the locations of the epiphyseal plates in the hand and the fingers of a child. The diagram on the right here is a diagram of an adult in which the white arrows are showing the locations of the epiphyseal plates that have closed. Now, keep in mind here that bones are going to show up as brighter images in X-ray because they're more dense than the softer tissues around it. And so these little gaps that you're seeing in the long bones here, so these would be the bones of the palm right here. This would be the radius and the ulna bones here. And what you can see is that there are these little, what look like cracks in them at these white arrowheads here. But what these really are the epiphyseal plates, or the cartilage, I should say, of the epiphyseal plates. It doesn't appear as bright in X-ray images because cartilage is not as dense of a tissue as bone is. But you can see that in the adult hand, we don't see those gaps between the bones here, and that's where those epiphyseal plates have disappeared because the cartilage is no longer there, and instead that epiphyseal plate has been replaced by bone tissue. So that's how long bones grow longer during infancy and adolescence here. But bones also end up growing wider and thicker as they grow longer because they have to accommodate more weight, and so thicker bones will accommodate much more body weight better than thinner bones will. And so we'll see that osteoblasts and osteoclasts that sit on the surface of the bones work together to make the bone thicker and wider in places where bone sees greater stresses on it. And this is a process called appositional growth, where we get the laying down of new bone tissue and the removal of old bone tissue, but usually the laying down of new bony tissue outpaces the removal of old bone tissue. So the result of this is that our bones get thicker as they grow longer. So that's a little bit about how they grow thicker as well. So they grow thicker by appositional growth, and they grow longer by growth of the epiphyseal plates. Okay, so we've seen how bones grow in both length and width. Let's take a look at bone remodeling now. So bone remodeling is a process that's seen during adolescence and adulthood. And this is a process that occurs at the end osteal surface. So that means that this is occurring at the inner surface of the bone where the spongy bone is located and where the medullary cavity is located in long bones. And so this is happening on the internal surface of bones, not the external surface. And bone remodeling involves a combination of both depositing bone and resorbing bone. So basically bone remodeling means that old bone tissue is being replaced by new bone tissue, but usually deposition and resorption or adding new bone and removing old bone are occurring at the same rate. So we don't get an overall increase in bone mass here. We're simply remodeling the bone to better accommodate the stresses and things like that that we're putting on it. Bone remodeling actually happens at a pretty impressive rate. So every year about 5 to 10% of our skeleton is remodeled, which means roughly every 10 to 20 years you get a completely new skeleton. So that's pretty impressive for something that we kind of superficially think of bone as a really not very highly active tissue. But we do see that remodeling does occur at a very impressive rate. So we've already been introduced to the cells that are responsible for remodeling. They're the same cells that are responsible for causing bones to grow thicker and wider as they're growing longer. And these are the osteoblasts and the osteoclasts. So remember, the osteoblasts are responsible for synthesizing the soft organic matrix of bones, and then on that soft organic matrix, calcium will then crystallize. And osteoclasts are the cells that are responsible for breaking down bony tissue. And generally, as I mentioned, bone remodeling, so that is the addition of new bone and the removal of old bone occurs at the same rate. So we're not really getting any overall increases or decreases in skeletal mass. We're simply remodeling the bone to better handle the stresses that we're putting on it. So that brings me to my next points here. In that bone remodeling, it really occurs primarily for two reasons. It occurs, as I mentioned before, to keep bone strong in response to the mechanical forces and the stresses that we're placing on it. But bones also remodel in order to maintain calcium, blood calcium homeostasis. So let's take a look real briefly at blood calcium homeostasis, and then we'll come back to remodeling in response to mechanical forces as well. So maintenance of blood calcium, to essentially kind of back up here, let's take a look at what calcium is important for in the body. So calcium is important in skeletal muscle contractions. We'll see this in Chapter 9 when we get into the physiology of skeletal muscles. Calcium is critical for skeletal muscle contraction, and it would not happen correctly without calcium. We also see that release of neurotransmitters from neurons is dependent on calcium. We see that blood coagulation and blood clotting is dependent on calcium as well as cellular mitosis. And so we see that there's a lot of very important processes in the body that rely on blood calcium. The interesting thing about calcium in the body is that most of our calcium is actually locked away in our skeleton. So most, and when I say most, I mean greater than 99% of our body's calcium is actually locked away in the bones. And in order to do any good, or in order to be useful to the rest of the body, we have to release or liberate that calcium into a water-soluble form that will then be put into the bloodstream so that our other cells and tissues can use it. So let's briefly look at how this happens, and we'll look at it kind of from the perspective of the homeostatic balance that we discussed in Chapter 1. So typically, blood calcium is very carefully balanced within a range of about 9 to 11 milligrams of calcium per 100 milliliters of blood. As we mentioned before, calcium is important in muscle contraction, neurotransmitter release from neurons, coagulation of blood, and mitosis or cellular division. And so we need to make sure that blood calcium is very carefully maintained within this range here. And this is hormonally controlled. And so particularly if blood calcium starts to drop, the parathyroid glands, which are on the posterior side of our thyroid gland, our thyroid gland is essentially wrapped around the trachea in the lower part of our neck here. And on the posterior side of the thyroid gland are these small little bead-shaped parathyroid glands. And these parathyroid glands release parathyroid hormone, which regulates blood calcium homeostasis. What parathyroid hormone does is, as parathyroid hormone concentration increases in the blood, parathyroid hormone stimulates osteoclasts, and osteoclasts break down bone. And so what they do is they end up dissolving the calcium minerals that are in bones and releasing those calcium minerals into the blood. And so the more parathyroid hormone we have being released, the more osteoclast activity we have, and the more calcium being released into the blood, which will correct that imbalance and bring our blood calcium levels back to 9 to 11 milligrams per 100 milliliters of blood. So we see that even very small shifts in blood calcium levels can cause really severe nervous system and muscular problems. So hypocalcemia, in which we have really low levels of blood calcium, essentially cause hyperexcitability of both the nervous system and the muscular system. Whereas hypercalcemia, where we have really high levels of calcium in the blood, essentially kind of depresses the neuromuscular system, and it makes the nervous system and the muscular system non-responsive. So we have to very carefully maintain, our body has to take care to make sure that our blood calcium is in balance there. Not only does high levels of calcium cause non-responsiveness in things like the nervous and muscular systems, but high levels of blood calcium can cause calcium to crystallize in either blood vessels or in the kidneys, And if it crystallizes in the kidneys, then that causes the formation of kidney stones, which can lead to blockages in the removal of urine from the kidney, which can cause problems there. So we saw that bones not only remodel to maintain blood calcium homeostasis, but they also remodel to keep bones strong in response to mechanical stresses and forces that we put on our bones. And so we see that bones actually end up growing stronger where muscles pull on them or where body weight and gravity are acting. And one law or principle that we use to describe this is called Wolff's Law. And Wolff's Law basically states that bones grow in response to the mechanical demands placed on it. So Wolff's Law really helps to explain why bedridden patients have weak bones, because their muscles are not exerting the same forces on their bones that they used to when they were not bedridden. And so this means that the mass of the skeleton is decreasing because we don't have those, the pull of muscular forces on them to make them stronger. Wolff's Law also explains why we see decreases in skeletal mass in low gravity situations. So the same situation applies with astronauts in low gravity environments. Their body weight is not being supported by their skeleton, and so because of that, the skeletal mass decreases. Wolff's Law also explains, kind of at the opposite end of this spectrum, Wolff's Law also explains why weightlifters have thicker bones at the sites where their largest and most active muscles attach to, because you've got these big strong muscles, and those muscles are exerting significantly more forces on their bones, and so in response to that, the bones will tend to thicken at the sites of muscle attachment to resist those pulling forces.